were born, you went into education yourself. Out of your academic year, you were very much younger than it. How do you think that impacted upon your own education?
It most definitely did. I experienced a situation where I was 6 months younger than everybody else and a year younger, because I was a February birthday and a year out of my age group. So coming back to the UK, I'd been educated abroad. Coming back to the UK, I was obviously at a significant disadvantage, and that would be symptomatic of the sort of disadvantage that a summer-born child could have, in that one's always trying to play catch-up. One's never quite in the same place as everybody else at an early age in your education.
Do you think that can impact upon their confidence and their sense of belief in themselves to be able to do better?
Absolutely, definitely. A sense of self-belief comes from your achievement. And if you're struggling to achieve, because if we take the example of the 4-year-old who is 4 years and 1 month, and the 4-year-old who's starting school who's 4 years and 11 months, there's a very, very significant, almost 25% different experience of life and growing up and the maturity that goes with it. So the confidence that develops with that is really obvious, and you won't necessarily have that same physical confidence, emotional and intellectual confidence.
So you've just picked up on a statistic which was brought out by the Institute of Fiscal Studies. There's been other work by Cambridge Assessment, which is one of the Cambridge's exam boards, and they do a lot of independent cutting-edge research. Tim Oates being the chief scientist, and then there's Ofsted, who considers them a vulnerable group. You might like to go more into this, but how seriously do you think we should take these statistics?
No, I think we should take them very seriously indeed. Notwithstanding what I said, that we shouldn't make the assumption that anybody born in the summer will have a difficulty. But the fact that Ofsted list summer-born children as a vulnerable group within schools really, is a strong statement. And it means that schools must be aware of the significance of those children in that group, so that they are helping them. And I think that's the key, and we must come on to, is how we can actually help the children. Schools are helping them to overcome that disadvantage that they've had just because of when their birthday was.
And there's an emotional aspect of that too, which probably leads me on to sort of part of the next question, is that we were talking about there are sort of specific groups that are more disadvantaged by being summer-born. I think you mentioned boys and learning difficulties.
Yeah, no, boys certainly, and it's well documented that the boys and girls, through the age that we're concerned with, through the prep school age, mature at a different speed. And boys, it's true to say, and I think we can all, we've seen this, the boys are a little bit slower to get to it than the girls are. And there is research that shows that boys born between May and August are twice as likely to be identified as having special language and communication needs. And that is very, very significant, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And you also, but is there I think it's important, isn't it, to stress that this is really not for all children. You'll find a boy who's born in August who's coping absolutely fine, thriving and doing well. And I know that Simon did a bit of research, and there's quite a lot of successful people who've done very well in spite of being summer-born babies. You might want to talk a little bit about who they are.
Well, actually, it's very easily done on Google, and you can. I'm sure you can all play with this later on today, but there are, a lot of them seem to be actors actually, James Corden, Sean Connery, Rupert Grint, but there is one philosopher that I picked up, John Locke, the famous English philosopher. I think, there are people, of course, who defy all of these statistics, and, you mustn't be sitting here thinking, and I'm imagining that all of you have children who are born in the summer, otherwise this is of less interest to you, that there is intrinsically a problem, and there are many, many people that will prove just that, sorry.
So, now, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How is it that schools can manage the entrance procedure for immature summer-born babies?
Okay, so if we start with the entrance procedure, for example, just where I am head now at Thomas's, we have an entrance procedure that allows for equal numbers of children throughout the year. So we don't take the children who are born in the first part of the year and take their results that may be skewed and they may achieve higher. We spread the contingent throughout the year so that everybody's getting a fair chance and there is an even distribution throughout the year.
Because what strikes me is that's the sort of fundamental practical side of it. But what is the implication of a child that is not doing well, needs to have extra support, knows they need to, and these children are not stupid. So what concerns me, and concern me with my own children, is the confidence factor. And I know that you feel that there is more that can be done behind the scenes, perhaps by parents, to support the children as well.
Yeah, I mean, these support systems that we put in place are never just the school and the child. It must be a triangulated support system between the school, the child and the parent. And I think all of us as parents can, we probably play an even bigger influence actually than the school does in what we can do out of hours by giving gentle support. And I'm not talking about really aggressive overlearning and putting children in front of material that demands their attention in any sort of forceful way. It's just creating an environment where they're constantly being exposed to something.
I mean, I think that the fact that the child starting who's just 4 has actually got 25% less of lifetime experience is probably the most important point to get across. And I'm wondering whether teachers, and how a teacher in a classroom, she's got the sort of confident one who's just about to turn 5, shooting their hands up the whole time, and perhaps the less confident one who's just how can they do that within the same classroom?
In the same way as they differentiate for any learning need, and that's identification and knowledge of the child. So good schools will recognise that the younger child in the year group needs that overlearning and extra emphasis, and they will be aware as part of their planning, and they'll factor that into their differentiation, and that's exactly what we should all be doing in schools.
And I mean, if you have got a child which is palpably immature and really would be happier in the year below, how can you manage that in a country prep school and in a London prep school? And what do you say about this issue?
Okay, well that's where it gets quite thorny, because it's difficult to know when to make that change if one is going to do that, and also the end target of where the child is going to go on to is very relevant here. London schools tend to be much less sympathetic to the idea of a child being out of their year group, even if we're talking about an August birthday. If somebody is 14-1 when they arrive, there are many schools in London that won't accept that. But
Can I just interject here? Because I know you wouldn't be able to say this, but I actually did a story about this, and I rang up Westminster and had a lovely long conversation with Dr. Stephen Spout, who's left now, but he said basically, we don't take them out of the school year because we don't need to. But it's a good debate and it should happen. I rang Radley, and Radley said, no, we will take them out of the school year, but you've got to sign something because the child can't, your son won't be able to be in the cricket team. When I went and looked around a lot more of the country schools, which I alluded to earlier about the fact that they have to work just a little bit harder for some of those places, purely because of geography, nothing to do with their excellence at all, they were much more flexible. But going back to Simon about the problems, I don't want to, it makes it much more difficult if you're in a London prep school.
I think it does. And the difficulty also is when to identify if that move should take place. And there are inherent problems with a child repeating a year in the same school, because there are social difficulties there if the peer group that you've been with move on and the child stays where he is or she is. And that can be quite challenging. It can be challenging for the child and challenging for the school. So it's not something to be done lightly, and it's obviously something to be done in very, very close consultation with the school. It does occasionally happen, it happened in your case, Annabel, where children move schools and often for very, very good reasons. And that is a perfect time, if that's the case, that is a perfect time for such a move to happen, because the child doesn't have to go through that emotional upheaval of seeing their peers move on, and it can happen in a very easy, very natural way. A very effective and often successful way of doing this is to repeat the year at the end if the child has generally been doing well but not fulfilling genuine potential.
At year 8.
And year 8, where perhaps what happens is, rather than move on to the senior school as a decent common entrance candidate and would always continue in that sort of way, the child could have a stab at doing a scholarship and move on really, really strong at the top end of their year group. And sometimes schools will be happy to do that. I've had experience of that on a number of occasions, and that's been very, very successful. And it really genuinely does allow the child to move on and join the new peer group, feeling confidence, back to that word again, confidence, feeling secure in themselves and not playing that catch-up game.
Yeah.
But it is complicated, it's not easy. And I think if any of you are ever having those sort of conversations with your schools, you should be very conscious of that and the impact that it can have on your child.
So, my last question before we move into questions from the audience is, do you feel that the state system and some of these independent schools, the senior schools we're talking about really now, should be more flexible?
I'd love to see that happening. The independent sector, by its very nature, is independent. It can do what it wants to do, and it is flexible, and will be flexible with summer-born children right back to sometimes June birthdays, maybe even May, and you know, in negotiation with the school, there are distinct possibilities there. That is just not the case, and you referred to it previously, Annabel, in the state sector. And the idea that you can delay the start of your entry to school till 5, but you've actually missed the whole of that first year, it really defeats the purpose. So there is no flexibility there at all. And I think these lobby groups can push, and there is some traction on this in Parliament with politicians, because they do recognise that this is a genuine problem. But it's got to come from the state sector itself, not just from, you know, a small group of independent schools who are pushing it. It's got to be a real groundswell for it to actually have any effect, but it would make a huge difference.
Yeah.
The difficulty will just be knowing where to draw the line, and it's coming back to what we said at the beginning, whether the difficulty that the child is having is as a result of being summer born, or is a result of the child's natural ability anyway, or a combination of the two. It's a very, very inexact science, and it's complicated. I
mean, of course, actually, if a child is struggling a bit, maybe they would benefit in any case from being in the lower group, regardless of the birth date. But that's another issue altogether.